Beneath the rolling hills and storm-shaped coasts of the British Isles, ancient monuments rise from the earth. Stone circles aligned to winter suns, underground chambers built with impossible accuracy, villages preserved in time, and tombs balanced on razor-thin points. They were created by people with no metal tools, no written records, yet their engineering and astronomy still outperform what we can easily explain. So how did they do it? Why do sites hundreds of miles apart follow similar patterns? Why do their alignments and timelines clash with what archaeology expects? What were these places really for? And what if the biggest clues are the ones we still haven't learned how to read? Newgrange. In the soft rise of the Boyne Valley, where mist drifts low across the grass before the day finds its colour, Newgrange settles into its ancient posture, as though it has been listening longer than memory can hold, a mound of white quartz and dark granite shaping a quiet threshold between land and sky, its great passage aligned with a winter sunrise, whose light moves slowly along stone, as if reacquainting itself with an old companion. And yet the calm of this first impression gives way to subtle questions about how a Neolithic community dispersed across farms and timber houses gathered the knowledge, labour and intention needed to raise a monument whose geometry follows celestial rhythms with a precision that feels both deliberate and patient. The corbelled chamber rising layer by layer toward a capstone that has held its place for more than 5,000 years. Carved spirals unfold across the entrance curbstone, their grooves worn but still clear, inviting speculation about whether they marked cycles of time, boundaries of belief, or simply the movement of thought made visible in stone. And as archaeologists sift through the complex strata of excavation records, they find tools of antler and bone, beads of quartz, fragments of pottery, and the cremated remains of individuals placed carefully within the chamber, each detail drawing a portrait of a society capable of leadership and planning, even if its voice has faded. Though certain contradictions remain in the material record, such as evidence of repeated reconstruction phases that do not fully align with the monument's astronomical orientation, or signs that its outer facade may have been reshaped in the 20th century, based on interpretations that cannot be definitively confirmed against the original layout. Scholars debate whether the quartz stones truly formed a gleaming wall or lay in a forecourt on the ground. Their arrangement, a choice between two different stories of how the monument may have appeared when first completed. And the passage roof box, an architectural feature so precise in function, raises its own questions, for it allows the sunrise beam to enter only during a short period surrounding the solstice, suggesting a ritual calendar far more structured than the scattered settlement evidence would imply. Yet no clear records explain how such knowledge was transferred, nor whether it emerged from long observation or from traditions carried across regions whose movements have left little trace. The nearby mounds of Noath and Douth complicate the picture further by offering variations on similar themes. Multiple passages, different orientations, a wider array of carvings, hinting that the builders experimented with form and purpose rather than repeating a fixed blueprint. And within Newgrange itself, the mixture of local greywacke and imported granite reveals networks of procurement that stretched across rivers and coasts, though the routes used and the reasons for selecting these particular stones remain open to interpretation. Even the great spirals, triple turn motifs, and lozenges carved deep into curbstones and passage stones tug gently at the limits of certainty. For their patterns echo motifs seen at other Atlantic European sites, but resist a single overarching explanation, leaving space for theories ranging from seasonal markers to symbolic expressions of renewal, all plausible, yet none conclusively demonstrated. When researchers study the monument's acoustics, they note how sound resonates within the corbelled chamber in ways that suggest intended effects. Though whether this was sought for ceremony, storytelling, or communal gathering cannot be known. Pollen samples reveal shifts in local vegetation around the construction period, implying phases of clearance and regrowth, and animal bones found in adjacent contexts show signs of selective deposition that may reflect feasting or ritual behaviour. Yet the absence of direct inscriptions means that interpretation must rely entirely on patterns rather than explicit statements of belief. Some investigators point to labour estimates, hundreds of workers over many seasons, as evidence of social coordination rarely associated with early farming communities, while others argue that smaller groups, working intermittently over generations, could account for the construction without invoking centralised authority. A debate that underscores how multiple models remain viable without resolving the monument's organisational origins. Radiocarbon dates place Newgrange 3,000 years ago firmly before Stonehenge and the pyramids, situating it within a broader Atlantic Neolithic tradition whose seafaring links are increasingly acknowledged, though no definitive trail explains how architectural ideas circulated or why this valley became the focus of such monumental ambition. Inside, the three-side recesses curve outward like petals of a stone flower, each shaped by intention, but none revealing precisely what role it played in ceremony. And as researchers analyse microscopic residues or trace elements, hoping for clearer clues, they often return only with evidence of long-past fires, human bone, and the faintest remnants of pigments that may or may not have once coloured the chamber. Even the alignment itself, so often cited with confidence, carries its quiet uncertainties. How much the horizon has shifted, how vegetation patterns may have affected visibility, whether the builders intended a symbolic gesture rather than an exact astronomical calculation, and how the monument functioned during centuries of use that likely saw shifts in ritual practice. Reconstructed models provide helpful approximations, yet each relies on assumptions that scholars continue to debate, leaving Newgrange poised between clarity and ambiguity. And as evening descends over the Boyne Valley, the mound's surface gathers shadow in its quartz facets, while the passage within darkens into stillness, reminding those who study it that the monument's endurance surpasses any single interpretation, suggesting a depth of meaning that may have blended observation, memory, community, and landscape into something that modern inquiry can approach only cautiously, sensing that beyond its measurable dimensions lies a quieter question about why this place, at this moment in prehistory, became a vessel for intentions that continue to glimmer just beyond the reach of certainty. Skara Brae. Along the wind-shaped edge of mainland Orkney, where the Atlantic presses steadily against sandstone cliffs and the sky widens into a pale arc interrupted only by seabirds, Skara Brae rests in its hollow, like a settlement revealed by time rather than built for it, its stone-walled rooms emerging from dunes that once concealed them for centuries. And in the gentle simplicity of its first impression, there is a calm sense of domestic order. Hearths centred, shelves carved from slabs, passageways linking homes in a pattern that suggests both craft and continuity. Yet even this tranquility soon hints at deeper uncertainties, for the village's remarkable preservation invites questions about how a Neolithic community living so close to the shifting shoreline sustained itself against cold winds and unpredictable seas, and whether its compact architecture reflects practical ingenuity or a cultural expectation shaped by traditions now lost. The houses, partly sunken into the ground for insulation, show an attention to detail in the placement of hearths, beds and storage boxes, and the uniformity of their layout offers an impression of shared values. Though archaeologists studying the site notice subtle variations, different orientations, slight differences in room size, modifications over time that resist any claim of rigid planning, and the absence of clear boundary markings around the settlement complicates attempts to understand its social organisation, as do the scattered artefacts of polished stone, carved bone pins, and finely made beads whose distribution across rooms suggests both personal belongings and exchanges that leave no written explanation. Midden layers rich with marine shells and fish bones indicate a diet deeply tied to the ocean. Yet the presence of barley, cattle bone and red deer points to a mixed subsistence strategy that seems surprisingly resilient for a community positioned on a coastline vulnerable to erosion. And pollen analysis from nearby cores offers glimpses of a changing landscape, grasslands giving way to heath, soils thinning under pressures that might have determined agricultural ambitions, though the order and pace of these transformations remain debated, as does their impact on daily life. Some scholars propose that deteriorating climate conditions contributed to the village's eventual abandonment, citing evidence of cooler, wetter phases around the late Neolithic, while others caution that environmental shifts alone cannot explain the careful sealing of certain structures or the apparent ritual closure indicated in one house by the deliberate blocking of its entrance, leaving open the possibility that social, cultural, or economic transitions played an equal role. Stone artifacts bearing incised markings add another layer to the puzzle, their linear motifs and curves, echoing patterns found at other Orcadian sites, yet offering no definitive key to their purpose, while the presence of small gaming-like stones and decorative objects invites interpretations that range from leisure activities to symbolic tokens, each grounded in plausible comparison, but none complete. One of the most intriguing contradictions arises from the settlement's longevity, occupied for centuries, and the suddenness with which it seems to have been left behind, the final layers showing minimal signs of disturbance, suggesting neither violence nor hurried flight, but rather a quiet end whose reasons remain elusive. And though Skara Brae is frequently described as a window into Neolithic domestic life, the very completeness of its structures introduces ambiguity, for the exceptional preservation resulting from sand entombment may give an impression of uniformity that did not exist when the community was active, raising questions about how much of what survives reflects continuity and how much reflects the particular moment at which the village was submerged. Comparisons with nearby sites, Barnhouse, Ness of Brodgar, and the larger ceremonial landscape surrounding the standing stones of Stennes hint at connections between daily life and broader communal gatherings, for pottery styles and architectural features share traits across these places. Yet the nature of these relationships, whether cooperative, hierarchical, or intermittent, remains beyond firm conclusion. The passageways linking Skara Brae's houses, sometimes interpreted as a sign of close communal ties, may equally have served pragmatic needs in winter storms, and the hearths, while often assumed to represent family centres, could just as plausibly signify shared spaces for craft, discussion, or ritualised activities that blur the line between domestic and communal. Even the stone dresser, often highlighted as a focal feature in many houses, carries. Its quiet ambiguity, whether it held tools, offerings, or everyday items, is not confirmed, though wear patterns on some slabs suggest frequent handling. And as coastal erosion continues its slow encroachment, prompting protective measures and surveys, new insights arise alongside new uncertainties. For ground-penetrating methods reveal hints of structures beyond the exposed core, raising the possibility that the visible village is only part of a larger and more complex settlement whose full extent cannot yet be mapped. When the evening light drapes across the low doorways and the Atlantic wind moves unbroken across the flagstone passages, the site seems to settle back into its long rhythm of exposure and concealment, offering a view into lives shaped by skill and adaptation, yet withholding final explanations, as though the inhabitants left behind a record detailed enough to invite understanding, but incomplete enough to remind modern observers that this quiet cluster of stone dwellings still holds its deeper meaning just beyond reach, resting between the evidence of its walls and the unanswered questions carried on the wind. Callanish stones. On the Isle of Lewis, where wind sweeps across moorland, that stretches toward a horizon of muted heather and distant hills. The Callanish stones rise in a quiet geometry that at first appears simply monumental. Their tall gneiss pillars weathered into soft greys that catch the shifting light, forming a cross-shaped arrangement converging on a central circle, whose calm presence stands against centuries of Atlantic storms. Yet, as one moves through their alignment, the scene begins to suggest subtler intentions woven into the landscape, for the stones create sightlines that intersect with hills and celestial paths in ways that feel both deliberate and open to interpretation, inviting careful observation rather than dramatic conclusions, and prompting archaeologists to consider how a Neolithic community on this remote island chose to invest so much labour into shaping a setting that blends ritual space with natural contours. Radiocarbon dates from peat layers enveloping fallen stones indicate that the complex was built and used over several centuries, a span long enough for practices to shift gradually, complicating efforts to reconstruct any single purpose, while pottery fragments and traces of hearths found nearby suggest gatherings that may have mixed ceremony with everyday activity, though the scale of these events remains uncertain. The main avenue leading northward, composed of parallel rows of stones, has been proposed as a route for processions, yet erosion, missing stones, and later peat accumulation challenge precise reconstructions. And although some alignments correspond to lunar standstill positions, the extreme points of the moon's rising and setting over its 18.6-year cycle, there is debate over how intentional or symbolic these correspondences were, for the visible horizon has altered over millennia, and the reliability of such long-term astronomical observations by early farming communities, while plausible, cannot be confirmed without written records. Excavations beneath the central cairn revealed a small chamber once covered by a mound, now long eroded. Its form too modest to serve as a grand tomb, yet too deliberate to be dismissed as incidental, adding to the puzzle of how mortuary practices intersected with the larger stone setting, especially since no significant human remains were recovered, leaving open whether the structure served a symbolic rather than functional role. Pollen sequences from surrounding moorland show that at the time of construction, the landscape was more open, with evidence of managed grazing and cereal cultivation, suggesting a community engaged deeply with its environment, though the gradual encroachment of peat in later centuries may have altered the site's visibility and changed how it was approached or perceived, factors that complicate attempts to understand the intentions of its builders. Geological analysis of the stones, sourced from nearby outcrops, indicates that transport distances were modest compared to other megalithic projects, yet the effort required to stand them upright and arrange them with such spatial coherence speaks to knowledge of weight, leverage, and ground stability, skills likely developed over generations and shared between settlements whose archaeological traces remain fragmentary. The surrounding minor stone circles and solitary standing stones form a wider complex, hinting at a landscape-scale design, though determining whether these were part of a coordinated plan or additions by later groups remains difficult, as stratigraphic relationships are often obscured by peat and by centuries of weathering. Scholars exploring the contradictions embedded in the record note that, while the monument appears carefully aligned, the avenues and arms of the cross vary in their spacing and orientation in ways that resist a single architectural blueprint, suggesting that the site evolved organically through successive phases of construction rather than emerging from a unified scheme. And the absence of domestic debris within the main circle implies that it was not a place of everyday habitation, though its proximity to fertile lands suggests it was accessible to communities living nearby. Small finds, beads, worked stone tools, fragments of pottery offer glimpses of activity, but no definitive ritual signatures, and the reuse of the site in later Bronze Age periods, indicated by secondary burials and scattered artefacts, underscores how meanings shifted over time, further clouding attempts to isolate a singular original intention. Even modern reconstructions of lunar alignments must contend with uncertainties in prehistoric observational precision, potential changes in horizon profiles, and the possibility that symbolic resonance mattered as much as astronomical exactness, making each hypothesis compelling yet incomplete. As dusk gathers on the moor and the stones cast long shadows that merge with the undulating terrain, the monument seems to return to its steady dialogue with wind and sky, offering a structure that is both clearly shaped by human hands and yet enigmatic in its layered history, leaving observers to sense that the Callanish complex, anchored firmly in its island landscape, continues to hold a quiet space where evidence and possibility meet without settling into final certainty. Poulnabrone dolmen. In the limestone expanse of the Burren, where the ground fractures into pale geometric plates and grasses, root themselves in fine seams between stone, Poulnabrone dolmen rises with a clarity that feels almost accidental, its portal stones lifting a heavy capstone toward a sky that shifts ceaselessly over the cast, the monument appearing at first as a solitary gesture of balance amid weathered rock. Yet, as one approaches its narrow silhouette, the simplicity of its form begins to invite subtler questions about why a Neolithic community chose this stark landscape for a tomb, and how the structure maintained its equilibrium for more than 5 millennia, its slender uprights bearing weight that seems disproportionate to their thickness. Though excavation has revealed a deeper substructure of packing stones that quietly stabilizes what the eye alone might misinterpret as precarious. Beneath the capstone, archaeologists uncovered the remains of more than 30 individuals, adults, children, and infants, interred over many centuries, their bones bearing signs of lives lived through labour, illness, and occasional injury. And the deposition patterns suggest repeated returns to the site rather than a single moment of use, indicating that Poulnabrone served as a communal locus whose significance persisted long after its initial construction, though the motivations governing these burials remain partly obscured by the fragmentary nature of the remains and the limited preservation of associated materials. Grave goods, such as pottery sherds, polished bone pins and small beads were found in modest quantities, pointing to ritual practices that were neither lavish nor uniform, and their stylistic affinities link the site to wider Neolithic traditions across Ireland, suggesting networks of shared belief or exchange, yet without revealing the specifics of those interactions. Radiocarbon analysis dates the earliest burials to the 4th millennium BCE, aligning the monument with broader megalithic activity across the Atlantic facade. But the architectural choices at Poulnabrone, its narrow chamber, the angle of its capstone, the orientation toward a slight southeast opening, resist neat categorization. For while some portal tombs share similar features, none replicate its exact proportions or placement on a gently sloping ridge that offers long sightlines across the Burren's fractured pavements. A landscape whose seasonal changes in vegetation and water flow may once have shaped the monument's symbolic or practical meaning in ways not fully understood today. Soil samples recovered from the chamber contain traces of pollen and charcoal that hint at small fires or offerings placed during or after interment, though the sparse organic record limits certainty and taphonomic processes complicated by the monument's open structure mean that some skeletal elements and artifacts may have been displaced long before excavation, creating interpretive contradictions between what survives and what was originally deposited. The capstone itself, weighing several tons, bears the marks of natural weathering rather than deliberate shaping, implying that the builders selected a naturally split slab from the surrounding bedrock. Yet how they transported it across the uneven cast terrain, whether by rolling, levering, or incremental lifting, remains a matter of informed conjecture. And the absence of clear quarry sites nearby introduces the possibility that suitable slabs were sparse, adding another layer of intention to its placement. Environmental studies suggest that the burren in the Neolithic was not the stark stone field it appears today, but a patchwork of light woodland and grassland, gradually reduced by grazing and soil thinning, a transformation that complicates readings of how the monument interacted with its surroundings. For what is now an exposed table of rock may once have been framed by vegetation that altered sight lines, access routes, or ritual pathways. Comparisons with other Irish portal tombs reveal shared structural principles, but also notable divergences. Poulnabrone's chamber is unusually elongated, and the low entrance height would have required mourners or participants to stoop or crawl, an act that may have held symbolic significance but leaves no direct trace. And the long-term, repeated use of the tomb contrasts with sites where burials appear more episodic or clustered, raising questions about whether Poulnabrone served multiple communities or a single group whose traditions endured across many generations. Osteological analysis reveals nutritional stress in some individuals, healed fractures in others, and indications of childhood illness, painting a picture of communities navigating the demands of subsistence farming in a landscape that could be both generous and harsh. Yet the choice to place remains within a megalithic chamber rather than in simpler burial pits suggests a collective impulse to formalize memory and identity through architecture, an impulse that remains legible even as specific meanings fade. One of the more persistent ambiguities concerns the monument's orientation, which aligns loosely with rising sun positions, but not with the precision seen at some passage tombs, leading scholars to debate whether the direction reflects astronomical awareness, landscape visibility, or simply the practical constraints of building on a stable outcrop. A discussion that underscores how multiple interpretations remain plausible without anyone achieving final authority. And although erosion has exposed the dolmen more starkly than in antiquity, modern stabilizations undertaken after the excavation have preserved the structure's essential form, while reminding researchers that reconstructions, however minimal, introduce small uncertainties into how the monument originally stood, especially regarding the height and positioning of packing stones around the chamber. The burren's geology, shaped by glaciation and time, creates echoes and channels for wind that lend the site an atmosphere often described as otherworldly. Yet this impression, while evocative, must be tempered by the recognition that such qualities may not have been experienced in the same way when the tomb was active, and thus the emotional resonance the site holds today may be partly a product of its altered environment. Still, as evening settles and the limestone takes on a muted glow while the dolmen casts a long angled shadow across the cast, the monument seems to withdraw into the landscape that has both preserved and transformed it, leaving a record that is detailed enough to shape narratives, yet incomplete enough to keep its earliest intentions just out of full comprehension. A reminder that within this quiet structure of stone and air lies a history constructed through careful evidence, but still open gently to unanswered possibility. Grianan of Aileach. On a hilltop overlooking the waters of Lough Swilly and Lough Foyle, where shifting light traces the folds of Donegal's uplands and the wind carries a muted sweep across heather and stone. The Grianan of Aileach rises in concentric curves that at first seem simply defensive, a dry stone ring fort, poised with quiet authority above the surrounding landscape. Yet as the eye follows the stepped terraces encircling its interior, the structure begins to hint at purposes more layered than fortification alone, for its placement atop Grianan Mountain suggests a desire not only for vantage, but for visibility, the fort becoming a marker as much as a refuge. And archaeological investigations reveal that beneath the early medieval walls lies an older rampart, partly earthen, partly stony, whose existence pushes the site's origins deeper into prehistory, complicating straightforward narratives about its function and chronology. Excavations conducted around the fort uncovered traces of ritual deposits and structural features that may predate the ring fort by centuries. though their fragmentary nature makes conclusions tentative, and the references in early Irish texts to a royal seat of the northern Uí Néill, while informative, mingle legend with history, leaving scholars to distinguish between broad political memory and precise architectural attribution. The fort's dry stone construction, with inward tapering walls rising in carefully placed horizontal courses, displays a level of craftsmanship that suggests sustained labour and a skilled understanding of weight distribution, and the interior stairways winding upward between tiers indicate that the ramparts once formed an accessible platform, perhaps used for observation, assembly or ceremony, though the absence of roofed buildings within the enclosure complicates assumptions about permanent occupation. Frost-weathered stones and the wear on certain steps imply centuries of exposure and repair, while 19th century reconstruction efforts, guided by partial ruins and antiquarian interpretation, introduce subtle uncertainties regarding how closely the present outline mirrors the earlier form, particularly in the height of the walls and the precise configuration of their terraces. Soil samples and pollen data from the slopes below the fort hint at periods of woodland clearance and pastoral activity, consistent with both Iron Age and early medieval land use. But the overlapping signatures offer no single moment when the hilltop definitively shifted from ritual landscape to fortified seat, and the continued presence of earlier ramparts beneath the main ring suggests that the site was reused, reinterpreted, and perhaps re-sanctified across generations. Scholars examining the fort's commanding position note its wide visual reach across waterways that historically served as routes of communication and conflict, implying a strategic dimension. Yet the near-circular precision of its walls and the lack of unambiguous martial debris leave open the possibility that its purpose blended symbolic authority with practical defence, a dual role difficult to disentangle in the archaeological record. Stray finds in the surrounding area, fragments of metalwork, stone tools and domestic pottery, paint a picture not of a densely populated citadel, but of a hilltop periodically visited, perhaps seasonally, perhaps ceremonially, their distribution too scattered to define exact patterns of use. Early accounts describe the fort's destruction in the 12th century and attribute the act to political reprisal, yet archaeological verification of this event remains limited, with the evidence for deliberate dismantling intersecting with natural collapse and later reconstruction in ways that allow multiple interpretations. The absence of substantial hearths or midden deposits inside the enclosure contrasts with the fort's imposing walls, suggesting that its significance may have been less about daily habitation and more about gatherings, proclamations, or rituals conducted in a place elevated above the surrounding lands, though the nature of these gatherings cannot be conclusively determined. The outer ramparts encircling the hilltop, now eroded, hint at earlier enclosures whose relationship to the main fort remains partially obscured. For while stratigraphic studies suggest pre-ring fort origins, dating these features has proven challenging, and their function, whether ceremonial boundaries, defensive earthworks, or territorial demarcations, may have transformed over time. Even the etymology of Grianan, often associated with notions of sunlight or royal presence, offers only a partial clue. For linguistic shifts and later interpretations complicate attempts to tie the name directly to a specific ancient belief or practice. The monument's alignment with surrounding peaks and waterways has prompted quiet hypotheses about whether visibility and orientation held symbolic significance, though the irregular topography prevents clear astronomical alignments and any cosmological associations, while possible within broader Irish ritual landscapes, remain unconfirmed. As researchers examine the masonry more closely, they note subtle variations in stone size and technique that may indicate phased construction. Yet, discerning whether these reflect chronological layers or practical adaptation to available materials remains uncertain. The fort's reconstruction in the late 1800s, carried out with earnest preservation intent, inevitably introduced decisions based on best judgment rather than definitive evidence, leaving modern investigators to navigate the overlap between original fabric and restored elements, a task made more delicate by the limited documentation of the site's pre-restoration condition. And still, when evening shadows lengthen across the terraces and the winds sweep unobstructed through the central court, the Grianan of Aileach conveys a sense of continuity that transcends its fragmented record, standing as a summit-bound structure whose uses may have shifted from prehistoric enclosure to early medieval seat to symbolic ruin, each phase contributing to a layered identity that resists final explanation, leaving the hilltop fort to persist quietly in its role as both monument and question. Its stones shaped by human intention, yet carrying a meaning that remains just beyond complete recovery. Ring of Brodgar. Across the wide bowl of Orkney's Brodgar Isthmus, where two lochs mirror shifting weather and low light spreads across water like a thin silver veil, the Ring of Brodgar emerges in a circle so expansive that its stones seem almost incidental at first glance. Slender uprights, spaced with measured restraint along a great ditch whose gentle arc becomes clear only when traced step by step. Yet, as one follows the curve of the henge, the monument begins to suggest a more intricate dialogue between land, sky, and human intention, for its builders shaped a circle more than 100 metres across without the aid of metal tools, carving a broad ditch into bedrock with antler picks, and organising the placement of stones that vary in height, form, and geological origin, in ways that hint at choices shaped by both practicality and belief. Though the precise logic guiding these decisions remains partly obscured by time. Unlike many stone circles, Brodgar contains no clear internal structures, only a few fallen stones and faint traces of later features, suggesting that its significance rested not in enclosed activity, but perhaps in movement across its perimeter, in gatherings that may have blended ritual, seasonal observation, and communal affirmation, though the scarcity of artefacts inside the ring challenges firm conclusions, reminding archaeologists that absence in the record is not always absence in practice. Radiocarbon dates from the surrounding landscape position, the circle within the later Neolithic, a period marked in Orkney by the flourishing of large communal sites. Yet the ring's relationship to nearby monuments, the standing stones of Stennis, Maeshowe, and the vast settlement of the Ness of Brodgar, remains a subject of ongoing study. For while pottery styles, architectural parallels, and spatial proximity suggest interconnected use, the precise sequence of construction and the social links between these sites remain open to interpretation, complicated by overlapping deposits, marshy ground that obscures earlier phases, and centuries of erosion along the loch edges. Some researchers propose that Brodgar served as a monumental boundary between domestic life and ceremonial space, while others caution that such distinctions may oversimplify a landscape whose meanings shifted gradually across generations, and the scale of the circle itself raises questions about how communities coordinated its construction, for the volume of material removed to cut the ditch implies sustained labour. Yet the distribution of temporary working floors or construction debris around the perimeter is uneven, suggesting either different episodes of activity or varying functions across sections of the henge. Geological analysis reveals that the stones came from multiple sources, some local, others transported from more distant outcrops, though none required the kind of long-range movement seen at other megalithic monuments, and while their varying shapes, slender lozenges, broader slabs, irregular columns, have prompted hypotheses about symbolic representation, the lack of carvings or consistent shaping limits. Certainty, leaving the circle to speak mostly through its placement and scale. Excavations near the ring have uncovered hearths stone tools and pottery sherds, fragments of activity peripheral to the henge, yet close enough to suggest gatherings or repeated visits, though whether these represent ritual feasting, periodic maintenance, or more everyday uses of the landscape remains unresolved. One of the more persistent ambiguities lies in the number of stones originally standing, somewhere between 48 and 60, yet reconstruction of the full circle is hindered by missing sockets, later disturbances, and the difficulty of distinguishing ancient removals from natural stone decay. And the incomplete record invites multiple plausible reconstructions without allowing anyone to claim final authority. Environmental studies of the isthmus reveal that the area was once less waterlogged, with greater expanses of dry ground linking monuments, that now seem separated by lochs, raising the possibility that the builders perceived the landscape differently, its vantage points and spatial relationships altered by shifting water levels over millennia, a factor that complicates modern attempts to understand alignments or ceremonial pathways between sites. The ring's orientation has drawn interest for potential astronomical associations, particularly regarding solstitial and lunar events, yet the sheer scale of the circle and the variability in stone placement make precise alignments difficult to demonstrate conclusively. And scholars note that symbolic significance need not rely on exact celestial targeting for broad seasonal markers, or horizon relationships may have played equally meaningful roles. The ditch itself, when viewed in cross-section, reveals clean cuts into bedrock that suggest deliberate shaping rather than simple excavation, though the absence of ramparts or obvious banks means that the henge form at Brodgar differs from typical defensive or enclosed structures, reinforcing the idea that its boundary may have been conceptual rather than protective, a threshold marked by descent into the ditch and ascent toward the interior, though how this transition was understood culturally remains unknowable. Studies of microscopic residues within the ditch deposits show traces of charcoal and small animal remains, yet these are too sparse and too mixed by natural processes to define specific activities, leaving open whether fires were symbolic, incidental, or associated with gatherings held on the henge's outer edge. Connections to the Ness of Brodgar, whose monumental buildings, decorated stone slabs and dense occupation layers reveal a remarkable architectural tradition, invite speculation that the circle formed part of a larger ceremonial network. But the chronological relationship between these sites is complex, with dates overlapping yet not aligning cleanly enough to establish direct coordination. And the variability in pottery styles across the isthmus hints at shifts in practice rather than a fixed cultural program. Even the erosion of certain stones, their surfaces fluted by wind-borne salt over centuries, creates interpretive challenges, for while weathering is natural, it also obscures any subtle shaping or markings that may once have existed, leaving scholars to consider whether the stone's current appearance faithfully reflects their original condition. And as twilight settles over the isthmus, turning the lochs into muted mirrors and casting elongated shadows across the ditch, the ring of Brodgar seems to return to its quiet equilibrium, a structure vast yet understated, monumental yet elusive, offering evidence rich enough to invite insight, yet incomplete enough to prevent final certitude, a circle whose open interior continues to hold the unresolved space between what is known, what is inferred, and what remains gently beyond the reach of explanation. Maeshowe. On the low rise of Orkney's heart of Neolithic landscape, where winter light glances across waterlogged fields and the wind carries a persistent hush over heather and stone, Maeshowe settles into view as a broad, grassed mound whose calm exterior offers little hint of the intricacy within, its entrance passage angling inward, beneath layers of carefully laid slabs, toward a chamber whose corbelled roof has held its poise for more than 5,000 years, And while the first impression is one of deliberate architectural order, the structure's quiet precision soon begins to suggest deeper questions about intention and continuity. For Maeshowe's alignment on the midwinter sunset, allowing light to reach far into the passage during only a brief seasonal window, stands out within the Orcadian megalithic tradition, not for flamboyance, but for the subtle accuracy achieved by builders who left no written explanation of their purpose. And as archaeologists examine the monument's materials, they find that many of the stones were quarried from nearby outcrops, some transported with clear effort across wet ground, their surfaces showing traces of shaping that imply planned assembly rather than ad hoc construction. Excavations reveal that the mound originally rose higher and more sharply than its present form, with a surrounding ditch whose function remains uncertain, perhaps a symbolic boundary, perhaps a practical means of sourcing construction material. And while the chamber's side cells suggest spaces intended for deposit or ritual activity, their precise role is clouded by the absence of primary Neolithic remains, for most of the original deposits had been disturbed long before careful excavation, leaving only fragments of bone and stone to hint at early use. One of the site's most intriguing contradictions lies in its later history. For Maeshowe was entered in the 12th century by Norse travellers who carved runic inscriptions into its walls, their messages ranging from brief names to longer statements, reflecting a momentary presence within a much older monument. And these carvings, though historically invaluable, complicate attempts to distinguish original Neolithic surface modification from medieval intervention, while also testifying to a continued interest in the mound, long after its original context had shifted. Soil and pollen samples from around the mound show that its surroundings were more open in prehistory, with signs of cultivation and grazing, yet reconstructing visibility lines remains challenging because changes in water levels across the Brodgar landscape have altered the horizon, affecting interpretations of how precisely the winter sunset alignment functioned millennia ago, and whether atmospheric conditions or topographical shifts influenced the way light entered the passage. Comparisons with other passage tombs across Orkney and beyond reveal both parallels and divergences. Corbelled chambers are common, but Maeshowe's proportions, central height and extended passageway stand out, suggesting either a regional elaboration of a shared tradition or a localized expression of architectural knowledge that had evolved through generations of experimentation, though the absence of transitional structures in the immediate vicinity makes the developmental sequence difficult to chart. Structural studies indicate that the builders understood not only weight distribution but also water management, as the mound's layered construction and the slight incline of the passage mitigate infiltration. Though adjustments made during later excavations and 19th century clearance introduce subtle uncertainties into how effectively the original design functioned. The stone used for the chamber shows weathering patterns that predate medieval entry, implying long exposure to internal humidity cycles, and residues found in crevices, traces of soot, small bone fragments, and minute charcoal flecks provide clues that fires or lamplight may have been part of its early use, though the scale and purpose of such illumination cannot be confirmed. The distribution of worked stone fragments outside the mound suggests that a construction yard once existed nearby, yet the arrangement of these fragments is too disturbed to reconstruct specific building stages, leaving open questions about whether a formal blueprint guided the work, or whether the structure emerged through incremental adjustments as layers rose. Archaeological debate continues over whether Maeshowe functioned primarily as a tomb, a seasonal observatory, a ceremonial chamber, or a convergence of all three roles. For the evidence supports each interpretation in part, while withholding a definitive resolution, and the absence of unambiguous burial assemblages contrasts with the architectural grandeur usually associated with strongly funerary sites, prompting the consideration that the monument's role may have shifted over centuries of use. The passage orientation, while broadly consistent with midwinter solar alignment, is not mathematically perfect. And scholars note that horizon changes over millennia may have subtly shifted the apparent precision, complicating efforts to determine whether the builders sought exactitude or symbolic resonance within a broader seasonal framework. Even the runic inscriptions, though late, offer hints about how the mound was perceived in the medieval period, as a place worthy of entry remark and perhaps quiet consideration, yet their presence overlays the Neolithic narrative with another layer of cultural meaning that must be carefully separated in interpretation. And as twilight descends across the loch margins and the mound settles into shadow, Maeshowe retains its quiet equilibrium between evidence and elusiveness, a structure whose enduring alignment and architectural mastery speak clearly of intention, yet whose deeper significance remains partly obscured by time, leaving the chamber and its long, low passageway to hold a space where archaeological understanding converges with unanswered possibility, a place in which the winter sun continues to trace a path that hints at meaning even as it refuses to fully reveal it.